Let's talk about Vivek. Vivek.
He gets particular about that. I don't
Vivek Ramaswamy.
Yes.
Well, he should just have he should have a nickname. Let's call him Vic or something. Because anyway, he's got a complicated name, but
Yes.
I think he's actually an interesting character.
Yeah, he was on Timcast the day after me, so I'm gutted I didn't get to meet him.
Oh, right. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because I know people in our circles. I mean, they're all about sort of Trump, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's just put it back to Trump. I like Trump a lot. I completely get why people are behind the whole Trump thing, but and he did do something remarkable. I mean, he did break effectively the fourth wall. We see the globalists, we see the media, we see the elite class, what they really are now.
The emperor has no clothes.
Yes. And Trump did that for us.
Yes.
So I unironically believe he should be on Mount Rushmore because it would just annoy the libs even further. But he did a genuine service. He did the emperor's new clothes thing, like you say. But he also has very big failures.
Yeah. Appointing Anthony Fauci, the stimulus spending under COVID.
Well, he's still very much pro the thing in the arm.
Yeah,
even now,
allying with Lindsey Graham, appointing Jared Kushner.
Well, that's the other thing.
Policy.
He's got an awful friend enemy radar. So yeah, like you say, pro Kushner, but he fired Steve Bannon.
Yeah,
who?
Well, actually, he reunited with him recently at the Sound of Freedom.
Oh, good.
Screening. So and he's because of that film screening, he said he wants to give the death penalty to child traffickers. Based.
I interrupt this segment to bring you an important message about this stuff, the dollar. Not going so well, is it? Inflation is out of control and debt is even more out of control. In fact, the US government is on the verge of spending $1 trillion a year just servicing its debt. It spends about $6.6 trillion and it only collects about $4.6 trillion in revenues. So you can see that this situation is, rapidly taking a turn for the worse. You might want to consider some gold and silver. And that is why that we've done a partnership deal with Goldco and we've created LotusEatersGold.com. Go and check that out. It's an offer for our American viewers. You can transfer a proportion of your IRA into this, and if you do so, you're going to get some of this lovely stuff, some bonus silver thrown in on top, up to $10,000. Or you can even take delivery of the physical gold to your home address if you prefer. So if you want money that goes clang when you put it down, check out LotusEatersGold.com.
That is good, but he did boot out Bannon and bring in people like the bloody mustache man,
John Bolton.
Yes, so his idea of friend enemy distinction is basically who's sucking up to him at the time rather than telling him the hard truths. So I don't like that at all. And also he hung people out to dry like Michael Flynn. And there's not just Michael Flynn; he's the most prominent example. But there was a whole bunch of people.
Well, the January 6th protesters who he could have pardoned before he left, but instead he went with Kodak Black and doubled down on criminal justice reform with Kim Kardashian.
But like, if Trump, this wouldn't happen. But if Trump offered me a job, I would just say no because I know that the establishment would come after me, and then they would tie me up, and I would basically lose everything in legal fees, and he wouldn't lift a finger to help. And it wasn't just Flynn; it was a whole bunch of people who he let down. And the other thing is, he wraps himself in the rainbow flag.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't like that. He constantly deferred to the left, and he let them slow him down massively. So it's like, oh, you want an inquiry into this? Okay, well, let's spend like 40% of my time engaging with your bloody inquiry into your made-up nonsense. So
he also didn't send in the federal guard to crack down on the George Floyd riots.
He's got a lot of boomer assumptions because he gets all of his news from the TV, even though he's getting it from Fox News. It's still TV is.
Well, it's Fox News. It's just containment.
Yeah, exactly.
And bear in mind, I actually really like Trump. I just have major criticisms of his first term.
Yeah. So. Exactly. So I'm on board all of that. If Trump is elected if Trump is a nominee next time round, I'll be extremely happy, even though I think that the FBI will basically just take over the count.
Well, he is hoping to do Schedule F and get rid of them all. But that's if he wins the most safe and secure election of all time the second time round.
Yeah, exactly. So I have concerns about that. So that's why I've sort of been thinking more broadly about this. There's DeSantis, of course.
No.
But I've
no.
Just a flat no.
No.
I've only ever seen him in the TV soundbite format.
No, okay, so signed hate speech bill which applies to Florida citizens while in Israel. Recently has made lots of blunders with AI deepfakes of Trump hugging Anthony Fauci and falsifying his voice and not acknowledged their deepfakes. And also has done campaign ads recently which one of them was very funny, but it's terminally online. The most recent one had the black sun and Ukrainian soldiers marching at the end to an image of DeSantis. Yeah, so he's committing campaign suicide, and I don't trust that his giant war chest from the establishment isn't going to compromise him on foreign policy.
Yeah. Okay. I haven't seen enough from DeSantis yet to really know how the guy thinks because he's just doing the TV stuff, and you can't tell what people want, what people are like from the sound bites. I've been getting drawn to these more, marginal candidates. Yeah.
Vivek is now third place, and he's nearing DeSantis's major loss.
Well, I did a segment previously on RFK, and I really like him, even though he's a Democrat, right?
He's
I do.
Pro-choice, anti-nuclear, gun grabbing.
But I'll tell you the pitch for RFK is, you can simplify. I mean, what are the three branches of government in the United States? Yes. It's Pfizer, BlackRock, and Raytheon.
Yep.
Right. And RFK wants to basically, even though he doesn't go after BlackRock, which I would love, that's my thing. He wants to smash the regulatory straight, which takes out Pfizer, and he wants to go after the military-industrial complex and close down the CIA, which takes out Raytheon.
Yes.
Now, even though of all of those things that you mentioned, if he were to take out those two pillars, the regulatory state and the military-industrial complex, that is worth a huge amount to me.
I agree. Okay.
Right. So, and also the thing I really like about RFK is because he's a more marginal candidate, he goes on the long-form discussions, and you find out what the man really thinks about stuff.
Yes.
Rather than this boomer TV soundbite thing, which I just hate.
Well, Trump isn't even doing the debates this time around.
Yeah,
he's refused to. Whereas Vivek is going on shows like Tim Pool's multiple times and giving long-form interviews. He needs to go on Rogan as well. I'm sure he's probably been invited.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, if DeSantis or Trump, I would love to see DeSantis or Trump go on, or even Biden go on a long-form discussion like Rogan.
I think DeSantis did one with Ben Shapiro, but then that's not saying much.
Right. Okay. That's probably why I didn't notice that one. Yeah. While we're talking about Trump, we ought to mention this from the website, which is a comics corner on superheroes by Connor. What do you talk about on that one?
So this is the first part of a two-parter. The second part should be coming out this next month. And This is just the entire history of the American comics industry, including how it was probably funded by the mafia and how it reflects American values over time. So in the Second World War, it was American patriotism. In the Cold War, it was smashing the commies. And as we'll get up to in the modern age, it's now just America.
So that is propaganda too.
It's propaganda, but it was good propaganda. Everything's propaganda. Let's be frank. It's just whether or not it's for our side or it isn't. Friend-enemy distinction.
So let's get into Vic. He's been doing some long form, and I'm going to draw from that, but I'm also going to draw from some short form because basically he just makes the point quicker. But let's try and get into the head of this man and see what he thinks. Let's go to the first clip.
We have to end this war. We can end this war and start prioritizing the interests of actual U.S. citizens here at home.
So I think, judging by the response you just got, I think a chunk of, I don't know what percentage, but a lot of Republican primary voters agree with you. Not all, but a lot. I don't think any Republican donors agree with you.
I think that's accurate. And to be really honest with you, I've lost many large donors or prospective donors over this issue. And it puzzles me. Because I think the tempting thing to say is to have some conspiratorial explanation that they have money at stake and government contractors, Raytheon or whatever. I don't think that's true, actually. I think there's something else going on in the psychology of an establishment in both the Republican Party and the Democrat Party that is reluctant to the idea that we somehow can't be the ones fighting the war that's the popular war of the day, the politically correct war. I think there's no such thing as a politically correct war. And so what I ask is, how are we actually going to end this conflict in a way that advances U.S. interests?
So this is the smart bit.
And the thing that puzzles me, Tucker, is nobody in either party is talking about this right now. The Russia-China alliance is the single greatest threat that the U.S. actually faces today. And we are pushing Russia closer into China's arms by actually continuing to arm Ukraine. So what I've said is that I would negotiate a deal that ends the Ukraine war, frees the current lines of control. Yes, that means giving part of the Donbas region to Russia. I would make a hard commitment that NATO never admits Ukraine to NATO. And those seem like unspeakable words in certainly the Republican donor class. But we get something greater in return, which is that Putin, in that case, would have to exit his military partnership with China and remove nuclear weapons from Kaliningrad, which border Poland, and get the Russian military out of Cuba and Venezuela and the West. And this is a deal that Putin should do because he ends up winning. He gets things that he doesn't have today, but it secures American interests too.
So this one is important for me because obviously this war was stupid. It was ginned up by the US. They sort of pushed them into it, and it's a complete disaster. People are just getting butchered. It is bloody horrible. That war absolutely needs to end. Trump has said he's going to do a deal and end it, but he's quite smart because what he's recognised is that deal is achievable. It's Putin would want to go for it, and it advances US interests in the same time. Because this is the absolutely crazy thing about the Biden regime, is they've basically looked at their geopolitical rivals, and each of their geopolitical rivals, China, Russia, and say India,
and Iran.
Yeah, well, yeah, to the extent there's rival, but none of those are really a US beater by themselves. China has horrendous demographics. I mean, they were a country that on their way to 2 billion, and they're going to get to like 700 million at some point in the next decade because their one-child policy. So they've got horrendous demographics, but they've got lots of capital, they've got lots of know-how, they've got lots of manufacturing capabilities.
And raw assets all across Africa.
Yeah, yes. Russia has got superb commodity base and energy. Demographics are not that great,
but they're slightly rebounding because of certain policies.
Yeah, they got fantastic agricultural reserves behind them. Especially they end up with the Donbass as well, right? And then India completes that loop because they've got the demographics.
Even though they're going sub-replacement, but you can still move people around.
The whole monsoon region, they've got superb demographics. I mean, I think the average age in India is something like 28.
Yeah,
right. So if you take those three countries and you smooch them into one Eurasian ally, you've got a US beater there.
Yes.
And the insanity of the Biden policy is basically trying to force these guys together.
Yeah, they're a matchmaker.
Yeah, and he recognizes that, and he's trying to undo it. Yeah. So this is the first really big tick for me because he's at least as smart as I am, probably smarter. Yeah. And that is my entry level for somebody who should be US president.
He's a long-term thinker.
Yes. So he can think, he can recognize the US advantage and take it. So that was the first one that I really liked. Let's go to the next one where he talks about Taiwan, because this was at first jarring, but actually quite refreshing. Let's listen.
You wouldn't defend Ukraine. Would you have America and the allies defend Taiwan if it was invaded?
I would, at least until the U.S. has achieved semiconductor independence.
So you would defend Taiwan?
Yeah. Because we depend on them for our modern way of life in a way that we don't on Ukraine. And in the latter part of this it sounds a little crass to some people, but I believe in being honest. I actually think that, I'll get to this point in a second, but to answer your question, yes, until we've achieved semiconductor independence. I believe we can achieve semiconductor independence.
Right. So, yeah, it is crass and it is blunt. I will defend Taiwan until we don't need their semiconductors anymore. But it's just bloody honest, to be fair. I mean, when Bush went into Iraq, he didn't say, we're doing it for the oil.
No.
Every war is always dressed up in these liberal concerns, these leftist liberal concerns.
Making the world safe for democracy.
Yeah. Yes. And it's obviously nonsense. And it's so refreshing to hear somebody just say, we can't function our modern economy without their semiconductors and they produce them all, so we're going to defend them up until that's not the case anymore.
Yeah, Trump did that in a slightly less advantageous way where he spoke to them about Saudi Arabia and doing a deal with them. And he said, we're going to sell them loads of weapons. It's going to bring in loads of money. It's going to be great. And they're like, what? Sorry?
Yeah, I mean, if the US really cared about the stuff that it says it cared about, it would invade Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
But it doesn't do that. It only goes for its interest. And the guy's just being honest enough to acknowledge that. So even though I found that a bit jarring at first, I like the fact that he's honest about it, and he is promoting US interests. And I get the sense that US people probably deserve somebody who puts their interests first for a while.
But also, I think the fact that he's trying to pry Russia, China, and India apart means that he might not need necessarily boots on the ground. He can actually take economic measures while shoring up American manufacturing to punish China for going into Taiwan somewhat.
Yes, and also the situation with Taiwan is different anyway because of the Taiwanese Strait. Yes. So basically, it comes down to who's got better submarine technology. Is my understanding of this.
Yeah, and Rory's written a really good piece on the website about that, saying that the West actually has much better naval capacities than the Chinese do. Because trying to form a beachhead on Taiwan, it's a very easily defensible little island.
Yes. How testable that proposition about our naval capacity versus theirs.
We'd rather not test it. However, in terms, it's much harder to invade Taiwan than it is Ukraine by just walking over
significantly. There's another bit which is my main focus on the economy. I'll play the clip and then we get into it. Let's do this one.
So there's a debate right now amongst Democrats and Republicans on how to deal with our national debt. Democrats say raise taxes. The only problem with that is that shrinks the size of the economic pie itself. It shrinks your tax base. Republicans are increasingly talking about making cuts to Social Security and Medicare. I think there's a third way, a better way. And surprisingly, nobody in this race is talking about it yet. It's one of my core issues. Economic growth. GDP growth in this country. So you're right. If we continue growing at 1% growth as we are now, we're going to run out of money. But if that number is just 3+% GDP growth, we're actually in the black. Our fiscal problems automatically disappeared. And we've actually, for most of our national history, grown at 4+% GDP growth. So this is possible.
I have a plan to actually get us to 5+% GDP growth. And it's not that complicated. First, we have to unshackle U.S. energy. Energy is the main input into the economy. Drill, frack, burn coal,
So that bit is
embrace
absolutely
nuclear.
true.
Do it without apology. For some reason, you're not even supposed to say those things out loud. I'm going to implement them as my policy. Second thing is put people back to work. I think a big part of what we've lost in this country is our pro-work culture in America. We've paid people to stay home. Take away the disincentives that we create to work itself. That's also one of the obstacles to GDP growth. Anyone who's building a growing business will tell you that finding workers is their main obstacle. And then the third thing we got to do is reform the Federal Reserve. And I've written extensively about
Now
this.
that's the bit I really
But I'll
like.
put the Federal Reserve back in its place and say you have one job. Stabilize the US dollar, period.
So at first I was listening to that and I was thinking, okay, there's hints of magical thinking here because let's just grow our way out of it is basically MMT.
Yep.
And so when you start saying, we can get to sort of 3, 4, 5% growth, I was thinking maybe a bit magical. The thing is, I think I could probably do it in this country. I'm less familiar with the US, but I could do it in this country. But I would have to basically be dictator because it would involve the absolute demolition of the regulatory system of much of the state. It would involve. I mean, it would basically involve winding back all of the EU regulations. It would involve doing the things that he then starts to talk about, which is to really bolster the energy situation. Because I've often talked about the absolute base tier of any economy is going to be agriculture and energy. And energy is probably the key one, even though we're doing a slow suicide of our agricultural base in Europe for some reason. So he starts to address it. Getting to 5% is, perhaps achievable, but he's essentially right. If you get the growth rate high enough, all of these debt deficit issues start to evaporate. And he is talking about the right thing. Whether it's actually possible to do it, because the immune system response to anybody who started to unwind the regulatory state and all of these departments that are holding everything back, there would be such a vicious immune response to doing something like that. But I mean, this is a guy who's started and built up several billion-dollar companies. So, potentially.
I have a few things to say on that. Number one, the way that they would slow him down is either bureaucratic gumming up the works, so you'd need a Schedule F style thing to get rid of most of those agencies. And he said in his recent Timcast appearance, and so I'm going to pull some comments from that off the top of my head, that he would absolutely do that. He'd get rid of some departments, like the FBI and the Department of Education.
I really like that, yes.
Some he would significantly depreciate, like the Department of Energy, the EPA, and the Fed. However, the concern I have is that the reason he got into the political fight, and this might be a strength and a weakness, was that during the BLM riots, his company asked him to put a Black Lives Matter statement out. So he put out one about equality of opportunity, and he got lambasted for it because it wasn't enough. And so he went, actually, screw you guys. But that does mean he might be initially sensitive to reputational destruction, which is what they went after Trump with. He might be immunized against it somewhat, but he's still quite a compassionate, attentive guy, and he doesn't seem angry and vengeful like Trump does. The second point is the growth idea. He has not ruled out an immigration moratorium. He has said skills-based instead. Now, what we've seen in Australia and the UK is that skills-based just means they set the limit for the amount of money you're bringing in as just above minimum wage. And so that's a way of providing growth rather than per capita.
It could be done that way.
I'd be worried that his State Department would try and do that under his nose, and he might not realize it.
So with all of these things, the devil is in the detail, but essentially what he's proposing is the right approach.
Yes.
So even though I'm going to say, that is a bit soundbitey, what he's saying is the right thing to do. Let's see if you could pull it off. But at least he understands the issue and at least he understands how to fix it, which I've not heard from any other candidate at this point. So RFK doesn't get the economy side of things at all. He doesn't approach it. Even though he's really good on those other things like the farmer and the military-industrial complex. He cannot do economics, whereas this guy can do economics, and he's a bit softer on those things that RFK are strong on.
Yes.
And he understands the problem in a way that I've never heard articulated from somebody like Trump.
The only positive I will say on the, not the only positive, but the positive I will say to add on top of this is that he's got the right heuristic in that if you're going for growth, there also must be certain things that are beyond the purview of the market. And he said, so like surrogacy and prostitution and things like that. Like capitalism without an underlying morality to hem it back in, you just get a universal solvent effect that commodifies human beings and makes them like a standing reserve. It goes from like being natural like the Amazon to being a product on an Amazon warehouse shelf. He understands on Timcast, he said that the parallel founding of the US was also Adam Smith's publication of The Wealth of Nations in 1776, same year. But he said his prior book was actually about the theory of moral sentiments. And he said there were certain things that needed to be ring-fenced out of commodification because they're equally valuable to the human project. And that's how you get the morality that undergirds the social contract.
I'm glad you said that, actually, because obviously we're time constrained in these segments, and there was a whole bunch of the morality stuff that I could put in. So, for example, he is essentially arguing that things like the trans thing, the COVID lunacy, the Ukraine thing, it is. He doesn't say this exactly, but it's filling a God-shaped hole.
And he does say that exactly on Timcast.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah,
So he was alluding to that in other interviews. I haven't seen the Timcast thing.
Recommend
but
it.
he was basically saying people used to have religion and family that provided their bedrock, and that would sustain them long term. Whereas at the moment they don't have that. They have these short term fads, and that's the only thing they can sustain. And that's why they have to jump. Okay, COVID's gone. Now we're jumping to the Ukraine thing, and there is going to need to be because Ukraine thing's about collapse.
Yeah,
because that's all drying up. There's going to need to be another thing that they can go all in on, which provides their 2-year or 18-month religion and family substitute. So he's really good on that as well.
Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned the abolishment of the FBI and the education. So I'll have to skip over the FBI one, but we do have a bit on the education. Can we play that one now?
I think the federal government is not, as a factual matter, directly involved in education. I think it is therefore a deadweight waste for money to cycle from the taxpayers to the Federal Department of Education to then disperse those funds inefficiently as they do, tilting the scales to 4-year college degrees over choices that people might have otherwise made that are better choices for them. Vocational training, 1-year, 2-year programs. Using it as a cudgel, and this relates to the latter issue you asked about, to tell local schools they don't get that money unless they're adopting what I certainly view as toxic racial and gender ideology-based agendas. They use the money as a cudgel to do it. So I've said that department that spends about $80 billion of taxpayer money, I'll shut it down. Tonight in New Hampshire, I'm laying out the anatomy of exactly how we'll shut it down. And then return that money to the states, to the people, put it in parents' pockets.
And shut them down.
Very specifically, you have to be a state that has a school choice program in order to receive that Department of Education shutdown dividend. I think that if you're such a state, I would also believe that those states need to write their teachers contracts in a way that stop teachers from joining teachers unions, which I think have been a destructive force on our public schools.
Good.
If you're unionizing against the public, think about who you're unionizing against, the very kids you're supposed to represent. Now we have transparency, we have choice. If you teach it in the classroom, put it online. And then there's an interesting fact in this country where I think you guys will appreciate how bizarre this fact really is. There's not only like a failed positive correlation, there is a negative correlation, an inverse correlation between how much money per student a public school spends and the actual outcomes that school achieves for its students. So in my version of school choice, my preferred version, it would not just be that parents get to get these vouchers and educational savings accounts to send their kids to some other school. That's part of the story. It's the first step. But I think any parent who moves to a school that spends less per student, which we know based on the data is actually all else equal a better performing school as it relates to achievement, should be able to take half the delta with them. So let's take Chicago or Pennsylvania spending $35,000, $40,000 per student. 15 miles away, you have a school spending $15,000 to $20,000 per student. I think they should be able to take half the difference, that $10,000 to $15,000, half that difference of the $20,000, say $10,000 they take with them. You run the math on normal investment returns. You're talking about $250,000 plus graduation gift when that kid graduates from 12th grade. So you tell me which is a better use of money. It's not even close. And I think the head of the state is yes, a federal bureaucracy.
Great idea. That's a great
Did you come up with that idea, or is that something that's out there by think tanks?
He was actually another guy's an arbitrager who's a friend, but who shares similar instincts.
So that's really smart. So I mean, first of all, love school choice policy.
Yes,
the voucher system. Well, there was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher who said we should do it here. It's such a loss that we never did it here, and obviously it's something which is a live issue over there. So really appreciate school choice. But the second point you made, I mean, that is a really smart way of incentivizing everybody, because if you want to dismantle something like the education department, you want to go after the teachers' unions, there is going to be a big organized opposition. So you need to incentivize everybody to give you to want to buy into the change that you're making. And he hits both sides here. He says to the taxpayers, okay, well, we're going to substantially reduce your taxes by the cost of the Department of Education and half the delta on the school fees that we save on this, so the taxpayers are incentivized. But also, and this is the bit that the what do you call it? The inner city caucus, basically the black community are going to buy into as soon as they understand the implications of what he's just said, because basically the schools that spend the most of the inner city schools, with the black predominated schools, and they're the ones who are overspending, and he wants to take half of the overspend and give it back to taxpayers, so they're happy, but he wants to take the other half and basically wrap it up and then hand it to family at the other end if they choose a cheaper school, which he says, if you invest that normally, that could be like $250,000 payout. So that is basically a large payout to black inner city kids when they come of age. So when they figure out what he's actually offering there, that's going to be massive for them. Now, I think there needs to be some thought as to how that is paid out, because if you just give them the lump sum, Nike stores and BMWs are going to fly in inner cities, and a lot of them are going to just overdose themselves to death. So you can't do it like that. But you could possibly structure it in a way which is to say, this will be paid out over the course of the next 30 years, but you get a criminal conviction and it just goes.
Yeah.
And then that way, everyone could sort of buy into that, because the taxpayer's better off, and they're better off as long as they, don't get a criminal record or whatever it is.
And if you also reform the compound interest that's paid on American student loans, because they do it very differently here, you could have it trickle upwards into a grades-based scholarship system as well.
Yeah, that's the other way of doing it. Instead of just giving them a lump sum, it basically turns into a voucher for higher education or skills-based training or something.
Yeah, or
like that.
even like a low-interest startup business loan, for example.
Yeah, or even a home deposit. I mean, there's the whole bunch
you could
of
get
things.
very inventive with it.
Yeah, there's so much you could do, but I like the idea of what we're going to do is we're going to tackle overspend on government by giving half of the difference back to the people that it was supposed to benefit, so that they can use free market choices to deploy that money for them. So that is really smart. Absolutely love that policy, because everybody wins on it, apart from the established interest in the teachers' union and the Department of Education. If you can do that in one area, you can apply that thinking. You can apply that to a whole bunch of different areas. So absolutely, I mean, that was really smart. So he's hitting for me, obviously ending the war, which is important, education, which I think is really important.
And fiscal responsibility.
Yeah, fiscal responsibility as well as that stuff. He doesn't go after entitlements, but then you can't get elected if you tell the boomers you're going to take away their gives.
Yes.
So he kind of has to do that.
You'd have to do reform when you get in.
Yeah, or maybe actually deliver the growth that he's going. But if he does deliver the growth that he's going, he's going to make a hell of a lot of enemies in the establishment. Right, let's end up on how he thinks that he's going to. Let's end up on the policy side, but how he thinks he's going to implement this, because he recognises that there is a huge legislative challenge to doing the things he's talking about. So he talks about what he can actually get away with in terms of executive power. So let's watch the next bit.
The first set of things that I like to do are the things that you can just do by the stroke of a pen. Okay? I'd end race-based affirmative action. First thing, Lyndon Johnson created it. It's an order. We can easily cross that out. I pushed Trump's people on why they didn't do it. They said it was a political hill they didn't want to die on. I'm not afraid of that one. I'll issue an executive order saying we're done mandating the measurement of carbon emission measurements anywhere through the bureaucracy. That shows up through multiple federal agencies.
Pluses so far.
That's part of how we unshackle the U.S. energy sector. I would streamline the permitting process for new drilling or fracking projects, something that holds back the U.S. energy sector again. I would also reveal some of the corruption that the public deserves to see. Anytime a government bureaucrat over the last several years has pressured a private company to take an action that the government couldn't take directly, censorship, stopping the lending to sectors like fossil fuels, I'll issue an executive order that demands that we at least publish that information so that the public can see it. Roll that log over, see what crawls out. Transparency is the first step to fixing corruption. I'd also pardon anyone whose prosecution was because of a politically motivated reason. That is to say that if normal people would not have been charged for that same crime, but an individual was charged, we have to actually set that record straight. I mean, even Julian Assange, I think, fits that description. So I've identified that as a bipartisan issue, or an issue that's beyond partisanship, somebody that I would pardon. These are things that you can actually do on day one to set a cultural tone for the country. I'm not claiming that those are the most important things to get done. But what I am claiming is that there are things a president can do that are quick, deliver real positive change. And then the last two that I would set into motion without asking Congress for permission or forgiveness is to take our military and station them at the border, the southern border, and increasingly the northern border as well.
Obviously.
If we can use our military to protect somebody else's border halfway around the world, I think we can and should use our military to secure our own border. That's something that the U.S. president can actually do. And we solve the fentanyl crisis in the process. A lot of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. don't like that idea. But what I say is if I'm the U.S. president and can't work for the federal government for more than 8 years, then I'll also sign an executive order for the people who report into me saying that none of those federal bureaucrats can work for the government for more than 8 years either. Replace those civil service protections with term limits instead. And I think that's how we ensure fresh lifeblood comes into government rather than an entitled, ossified bureaucratic state. That's day one.
They won, all right. And you just wrapped up
So
conversation.
that's a huge amount of things that hit a lot of points for me. So, I mean, obviously, securing the southern border of the military, that's an obvious one. Ending the political prisoners, so the Jan 6 guys and the Julian Assange, absolutely love that. Energy policy, which you talked about on some of the other one. Transparency for government actions. I mean, you just throw open the transparency, and then the internet will do the rest. The Reddit and Twitter, they will get on that.
Channel just
exactly. So that is absolutely brilliant, and I just love the last bit, which is an 8-year term limit for civil servants. Can you imagine how well the federal government would run if everybody in it, if it was just like a thing that you did during your career for 8 years? Okay, I'm going to do my 8 years of working with the government, and you'd have to pick your moment to go in, because you could either go in at a fairly low level and work in the DMC or something. It gives you some level of security for that period, or you could go in at a more senior stage if you're looking to sort of run something. But if you've got that permanent circulation, rather than people that work for the federal government for their entire lives and they just, as he says, ossified it, but it was just something that you did for a portion of your career, and then the rest of it was spent in the public sector, and you got that constant circle. I think that would be an absolutely wonderful thing.
The only issue I foresee, and you'd need some sort of holdover period of where you don't just get a kind of parliamentary pass that allows you to go back in a number of times back into the federal government.
It would be a lifetime 8 years.
And some,
what you suggested.
Yeah, but at some time, your communications still need to be monitored, because then you can just go straight out of the federal government and go into a company that can then lobby the government and do it more deftly.
Yeah. So again, with this one, again, the devil is in the detail, because there'd be a lot of detail. But as an idea of, rather than having people who work in the private sector their entire life and people who worked in the public sector, if it was just more the culture that you did a stint as a public servant. I mean, it actually goes back to the original idea. I'm going to do my public service. People who have, and what I suspect you get is a load more people who maybe retired just a little bit early, and you could incentivize them to do it by giving them some tax breaks around their pension, their private pension pot that they built up. Towards the end of your career or something, you go in and you do a bit of this public service, and then but it would just be so much better to have people who are not lifetime long federal servants. Because they're not federal. They're federal masters. I mean, the state system exists to perpetuate itself in its own interests.
And also the sort of 20-year-old know-nothing spads who are hired by CCHQ in the UK, who are just there and they're groomed up through the party with the party's ideology. So it's a challenge.
So I love the idea of making that just a part of your career rather than your entire career. We ought to address the Trump issue as well, because he makes an observation which is basically true. Let's listen.
So my view is that he was a successful president, measured by reviving the economy. A successful president, period. Why do I say that? Reviving the economy, growing the American economy. I think that recognizing and speaking to and partially addressing concerns that had been historically unaddressed by both major political parties. We did not enter a major war. We were on the brink of major conflict with North Korea, on the precipice in other parts of the world. ISIS was a thing. It is, it exists, but it's by and large not the same threat that it was after his presidency as it was when he took over. These are major accomplishments, right? I think the immigration crisis, I think, is far worse today, precisely because Biden's in office and not Trump. So I believe he was a successful president. That's view number one. View number two, he has an effect on people. About 30% of this country that I think becomes psychiatrically ill when he is the U.S. president. I think it's just a fact, right? Agreeing with things that they otherwise wouldn't have agreed with because
that 30% number applies on our pod too.
1 in 4. Keep going.
Well, I think it's just the reality is people lose their ability to process information. People lose the ability to think independently. It's like a demonic possession that happens in this country. About, as best I can tell, about 30% of the country. And I think that's not good for the country. And we can debate who's to blame for that or whatever, but I'm just stating it in observation that I feel pretty strongly about. And so I think most of Trump's policies were good. Do I have some policy disagreements with them? Of course I do. It would be weird.
Yeah, so there is a part of me that says we just need Trump and it will upset the left, and that's one of the features, not a bug. But it's not impossible that that country ends up in a civil war if it carries on the way it's going.
I think it's going to anyway.
It was getting ugly. I mean, it really was.
Still is.
Yeah, it still is.
They're still prosecuting him now. I think you're never going to circumvent the fact that it's going to be ugly. My prediction is, and I don't wish to rain on our parade, because I think Vivek would be overall my favorite candidate as I followed him. But I also preface this with, I know that he's not going to win. He's not. It's not his year, right?
Yes.
It would be his year to be VP. And he hasn't said that he would accept that yet.
Yeah.
But obviously, because otherwise his donors would drop out if he didn't think he was winning.
Yes.
But if he gets on the debate stage, he pushes these issues, he bows out. Ron DeSantis has burned all his credibility with both the base and Trump. That man, unless Trump bucks it and goes for Carrie Lake, but I reckon she'll go for Arizona Senate, that man will be Trump's VP.
So you've pinched my conclusion. That is exactly,
well, you're welcome.
that is
Sorry,
exactly what I was. No, you said it well, but that's the thing. I think he is much more of a unifier. He's clearly very smart, and he brings a lot to the understanding of how to actually solve this thing. But I think probably my biggest criticism of Trump, the criticisms that I made at the beginning, probably come down a lot to naivety. That he went in expecting the president to be given order and it to be carried out.
Yeah, he had the boomer belief in his establishment neutrality.
Yes, and maybe he has been disabused of that notion. Maybe a second Trump term, he wouldn't make all of the mistakes that he made in the first term. And if he had somebody like him as VP, and the reason I like him as VP is because he would be able to give that level of detail and market-based insights to the solution to a lot of these problems. It would be fantastic. And he would then have 4 years to see how the machine worked. And then if he became the candidate afterwards, then he could be really powerful.
Continuity candidate, exactly.
Yeah. So, yes. So, Vivek for VP.
Thank you for watching that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. If you enjoyed, why not access our website where you can get the podcast live from 1 p.m. UK time every weekday for free, in full, and uncensored. And for as little as £5 a month, you can get access to our library of premium content, such as my colleague Stelios' series Symposium, focusing on philosophy, with the latest episode with Bo and Josh talking about the linguistic subversion conducted by leftists. If you'd like to see what the rest of the content we're putting out is, you can follow Stelios on Twitter at Panayotu90st and the rest of us over at LotusEaters_com. Until next time, goodbye.